Hello and welcome to the live streaming broadcast of live streaming broadcast enthusiast Kyle Varela. Thanks for joining me tonight for this stream of live content created by a photo sensor and its perceptions or sensing of the light bouncing between various surfaces emitting from one or more sources and ultimately reflecting off of the features of my cranium's frontal side, known as my vital organ area, aka my avatar. Facing up to the fun of holding one's breath with the full effect of becoming winded by more or less invigorating one's anaerobic muscle fibers um, is somewhere in the range, I'd have to say, of the amount of fun that you would get if you per se had a race with a friend to see whose hermit crab could walk quickliest across the floor and make it to the finish line. Or some sort of like dual labyrinth scenario. You know, I've always liked the general vocality, or let's say general verbalization, I guess, verbalizability of the phrase "get a load of this guy," or hey guys, get a load of that performer. Get a load of that performer. Hey guys, get a load of that performer. Hey guys, get a load of that guy. If you guys thought that other comedian was funny, wait till you get a load of this guy. Isn't that I mean, it's susceptible to the effect of when you become, overly inundated with a sort of repeating either word or small phrase or whatever, that phrase like tends to lose, you know, objectable meaning or objectifiable interrelevance to anything, just because of the some sort of lack of there being a similar attribute to a inherent sort of type of phrase or word, which is, I guess, to say a little less susceptible to the repeating, equating to lessening of the like feeling or understanding or actual recall ability of the meaning of a word or phrase or whatever. But nonetheless, I'm pretty sure it's the word or phrase I think I'm thinking of. Sometimes, it could, and I, know it can be acknowledged in that regard because in thinking of it, I actually at first had thought I was, that the phrase was something along the lines of, would you get a load of yourself? Like, whoa, 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 would you get a load of yourself here for a second? And then I realized that phrase is actually, whoa, would you get a hold of yourself? And but that there was a phrase that conveys its meaning in a sort of load proffering from like one sort of suggester to like the suggestee to like partake in a like load of something like it's pretty 70s-ish sounding, and I'm thinking it's probably like like the reference to like maybe like a water pipe, or maybe like a smaller sort of like chillum or something, where you would pack a bowl of marijuana into the front end of the pipe or back end or whatever in the bowl area, and you would load it, and that would be loading it, and it would be like being prepared to be imbibed within a sort of like enlightenment or euphorification or something along those lines. And it has a similar sound to the sort of misremembered phrase and sort of thing, because the words load and hold are similar. And so yeah, I realized that. So I made sure to take the time to make sure that I was thinking of the phrase that I was thinking of, or that I was, that I was correctly thinking of whatever phrase it was that I was intending to think of, which was whatever the phrase was that actually did include the reference to like a suggestion to try, get a load of something or something like that, because it was funny. I in the scope of whatever sort of imaginary dialogue was out playing in my mind, I was, some person replied to the other person, like, hey, would you get a load of yourself? Like, and I was like, hey, that's funny the way there's a pretty clear, like, marijuana reference in a sort of colloquial, commonplace, phraseological, uh, conversation part, or like dialogue, rhetorical sort of familiar um, commentary or banter or whatever in between. Um, what I would regard to be, any sort of demographic of, conversation ease. I guess it's tends to bring to mind, your some sort of like friend group sort of thing. But anyways, so the phrase, although susceptible to its losing of like understandable meaning when you say it, when you hear it said like 3 or 4 or 6 times, like I just kind of demonstrated, saying, "Hey, would you get a load of this guy?" Like, "Oh, hey guys, get a load of this guy. Look, he's like playing with these like juggling sticks. That's like or like, would you get a load of that trapeze guy? Like, look at how many flips he did. That was just like mind blowing, or something like that." Um, I um, would have to say that although it, is, and not unlike many other words, susceptible to becoming less apparently understandable when you hear it, like, get a load of this, get a load of this, get a load of that, get a load of that, get a load of that, get a load of that. It's like, really, what does get a load of something mean? Like, it's like as if your science teacher was telling you to, like, do that, would it be like data sheet stuff, or like, does it like, I mean, but like, it sounds perfectly fine, like it could be like, now students, would you get a load of this information here? It's like, would you, would you get a load of this tritation here, as you see the, milliliter fragrance or whatever. Welcome to class today. Now, if you guys would get a load of the introduction of this chapter here, you'll see the very, plausibly interesting, it's like, I guess like in the scope of what might, there's room for, would you get a load of what this says here? But then once it turns out that it's not like, something that's like, psychedelically interesting, or, just like mind-blowingly awesome, then it turns out that it sounds like the person is describing something the wrong way or something like that. But that's kind of like the rough on the spot sort of review of me just doing those demonstration phrases of the phrase get a load of, and it's just my purpose in mentioning it, that I get, it gets to be, potentially, remembered or re-realized or whatever, because it's it's funny. It's like, it's one of those funny things. And so now to continue the rest of the broadcast with what has been somewhat of a recent trend in my broadcasts. Um, I will maybe glance at the camera a few times and do the anaerobic muscle fiber activating breath hold for some or other reason. Or maybe I won't, considering that the reason potentially might have been a sort of non-realized impulse, and if it were so that, then there's the chance that whatever sort of realizing I'm doing of the potential sort of to do that breath holding moment um, may play out to have a appeal from the point of view of the sort of self-determination we have as beings of a high intellect, that would have a preference of to not per se, and the health benefits, kind of outweigh the general scope of reasonings not to hold my breath at the current moment. Though that's not very, like, robust or, replete. I'm even guessing it's more or less, at least, adequate. That, I know that my general oxygen level in my blood is going to be, somewhere in the range of the right amount, because up until that holding a breath point, I'll be, breathing, whilst, either waiting to hold my breath or talking, if I decide to talk up to that point, or if it works out that way. and barring that and or some other, like, much more difficultly identifiable particular reasons why I would have to necessarily take into account, some other contingent or inter constructual in, the difference between a, existence that can persist through the normal space-time trajectory that the universe is going in, or can't, like, yeah, if perchance I was, like, going to be, like, holding my breath for, like, 2 minutes right before that point that I had mentioned, when I would then be holding my breath, maybe, which was still a maybe in general, well, then I would, then I suppose I would, I would benefit from that same sort of, I wouldn't benefit from the same sort of impulse, but I would benefit from a impulse of the same sort of functional level to not hold my breath at that point, because I would be incredibly, you know, um, so if when you really want to drink water, you're thirsty. When you really want to, like, breathe some air, are you, like, windless? I don't know. But anyways, so yeah, it's not it's not too hard to figure that, unless some sort of really interesting thing comes up, that I will then replace the breath holding moment with, you know, in some way, shape, or form, then I'll most likely take a breath and, utilize that moment to sustain a certain sort of aspect of my physiology, and in that, activate my body's anaerobic muscle tissue fibers and such. In case you didn't know, that's one of the main effects of holding one's breath. Um, the the muscles have two different types of functional operative modes, I believe, and or two separate like actual like constructions possibly. I'm not exactly sure, but I know for sure that they are either anaerobic and aerobic and aerobic. And something that's aerobic means oxygen containing, or oxygen involving, and something that's anaerobic means basically the opposite. Something that's specifically Speaking of oxygen, did you know that the oh yeah, that's right. I was gonna do the do what I was gonna get on the bandwagon of the trend of some of my more recent broadcasts, which was as described, some part or other describable as a activating of the aerobic muscle fibers, aka holding my breath, and such. And so, rather than explain what I was going to explain after I had asked if you knew a certain detail about oxygen, I'll skip the question part and just mention, no, because that's not that interesting if I don't do the question part first. Okay. Well, then I'll do that first and then I'll do the breath holding thing. Or, yeah. Did you know that the Earth's atmosphere at one time was not at all oxygen at all? It's now currently some sort of a percentage of oxygen, or maybe like 18 or 26 or some sort of reasonable number. It's mostly nitrogen and I believe carbon dioxide, or maybe carbon monoxide, or maybe dicarbon oxide, which it's not. I'm pretty sure it's more or less carbon dioxide, if it's any of those. Yeah. Nitrogen, I think, is like 50%, and then oxygen is like some amount. It's not a huge amount, it's a sufficient amount. I think maybe it's maybe the air is 30% oxygen, or maybe it's like 50% oxygen. I don't think so, though. Something tells me that when they have purified oxygen, it's described as purified as in regards to, what the air is, I guess, or, well, yeah, just the general thought of, oxygen in its sort of oxygen form indicates that, yeah, it's different than air, in some ways. So, yeah, about that time in the past, it was a atmosphere of other gaseous molecules and no oxygen, or maybe a very little oxygen. And then the flora of the Earth came to evolve, and it started releasing as a byproduct of the what are known as chemical reactions, like biochemical reactions, and such biosynthesis. The interactions of the molecules that make up the microstructures and such other parts of the life were indeed that particular molecule, the molecule we know as, excuse me, sorry, that was like a, it's like if I say I think again too quickly after I say I think, and I don't realize that it's like, it's okay to say that, but if I don't time it right, it sounds like some sort of weird, like, misgiving in the you sort of dialogue. But it's okay, because if I explain it, it's funny. Ha ha ha. So yeah, so I think that actually oxygen is both. I believe that that oxygen is a synecdoche for dioxygen, which is O2, di being the two part, O being oxygen part, because the molecular outplay of it being two oxygen molecules with like a double bond in between or whatever, or triple bond or whatever it is significant and notable in sort of like the way of like, how you would see it under an electron microscope and how it interacts with other molecules. But I think that as oxygen, it's more or less mostly of importance to, at least I guess maybe our hemoglobin, that it is just, that it's oxygen itself. And and I don't know, that's kind of a hard threshold on which to, like, place a valuation of the validity of there being a need to determine specifically what is being conveyed when one says the word oxygen. And it might even be that, oxygen is specifically O2, and that, monoxygen is how they say O, and it's just such an likely to be occurring naturally sort of thing, and then therefore an sort of specifically like addressed thing that it doesn't need its own, like, or it doesn't have enough participation in its, like, reference to its monoxygenness, that it falls under the blanket of the namesake which it gives the dioxygen as a synecdoche for its own self, which would be kind of funny and ironic, because that would be rephrasable as this: if if what we call oxygen, if what we mean when we say oxygen, for the most part, means O2, as in like the breathable gaseous oxygen that's like in the air in our atmosphere, it may very well have gotten its name from the molecule, the atom, the element on the periodic table, oxygen, like whatever one it is, I don't know what it is, which is O, and it's pronounced and called oxygen, and it's referring to one atom of oxygen when it's saying that and meaning that. And dioxygen being overly specific because of the lack of referencing ever to monoxygen, outside of the periodic table reference, which is, a given. Anything on the periodic table is like, referencing to like one of the one molecule of the substance, which is always a single atom molecule, and it's like the atom molecule that is that substance or whatever. And then if that were so, and oxygen itself, which would then be required to be called monoxygen for some sort of reason because of the specification that oxygen meant dioxygen, and then became also, though, referenceable to as oxygen because although the requirement to call it monoxygen kind of existed in this hypothetical imaginary sort of outplay of like this thing that I'm saying is funny, it was kind of more or less easy to group the periodic table element oxygen, single O, into the scope of the reality of oxygen in general, which it is, which oxygen, dioxygen, O2 also is, which got its colloquial name or common name of just being called oxygen from oxygen itself on the periodic table, the single atom, which then is referenced to synecdochally instead of as monoxygen, just as oxygen, under the blanket category of dioxygen's simplification from its, containing two of oxygen itself. It's kind of it's pretty cool. It's not your everyday average potential unique, potentially humorous naming convention, and so that would be funny, I would have to say, in case you care to know. And yeah, and so anyways, did you know that the oxygen that we breathe is in the atmosphere, and that at one time, though, it wasn't. The Earth wasn't always an oxygen the layered rock. It was at one point a non-oxygen containing atmospheric layer surrounded rock and whatever. With not a whole lot of conceivable or imaginable habitability to our physiological, chemical sort of self-understanding and understanding of life. It was like, had like, sulfur dioxide or some sort of, sulfuric acid sort of stuff, and like, all of these other non-habitable for our chemical composition and makeup type of species parts and constituents to it. It was, that, and contained also carbon dioxide and what have you, released from the earth and whatever, that whole thing, the whole vents and eruptive volcanic stuff and stuff. Anyways, the blue-green algae evolved into, plant life. And as the plant life would be, replicating its cells and going through its process of incorporating the chemicals in and around it into its, constructing of a multicellular organism, or just repeat, which I believe is what generally is one of the main I think that single-cell plants would be more or less referred to, I think, as algae and aren't plants. But So in creating their multicellular existence, and making those surrounding, available chemical like ingredients, or nutrients, I guess that you refer to it as. There would be the there was the, and still is the, occurrence of the release of a certain sort of molecule known as, well, that stuff in the air that, helps us live. And there were so many of these, you know, plants and potentially oxygen releasing algae, because I don't know if that's part of how algae works or not. I'm assuming it might be. There were so many of these flora that the Earth's atmosphere eventually changed entirely in its composition because of the gas released by the reaction of those flora. And then the blue-green algae said, well, would you get a look at that? Or maybe they said, well, would you get a load of that? I don't know. I guess that kind of works. Would you guys get a load of the new atmospheric composition? Look what all the flora did. Those are our... So were the, extant blue-green algae that were coexisting with the, emerging flora, if they were, considering themselves also flora, which I believe they would fall under that category, were they floraists? Anyways, so my rhetoric sort of question was, did you know that the Earth's atmosphere used to not be oxygen containing at all? And then, now after explaining the beginning of the movie The Land Before Time, just joking, that's a different story, but with the succinct knowledge that plants did make the atmosphere breathable, it brings up the succinct sort of fear or worry that if plants weren't here making oxygen, that we might not have any to breathe. And that mostly is the feeling from the point of view of a person who generally might not notice per se how many freaking plants there are. They're everywhere. There's a million trillion plants. Possibly more. They indeed actively replenish the oxygen needed to do dances, and think of dances and choreograph dances and any other sort of thing that that we do, or any of the other sort of animalia do. It's very nice of them to continue doing that. I am a big fan of the decision that made at the Council of the plant A, floor A, oxygen A, which I believe either I'm imagining this or it's part of the evolution of the sort of Renaissance era plants when they, decided to continue to replenish the oxygen for the sole purpose of, rather than politically benefit from being able to create a large plant, city-state, and then make their way up the chain of, the Mesopotamian empirical arena per se, that they would rather that they that they would that the that the better choice was to rather get I guess maintain per se, or give it another good solid, like, good faith go at supplying of the plenishment for the replenishment of the oxygen in the atmosphere, and just try and find the available amounts of carbon dioxide for their you know reactionary necessity. In whatever way they needed to, be it being more conservative with how much carbon dioxide they were uptaking, or just being in more efficient carbon dioxide uptaking landscapes, or positioning or whatever, because yeah, it was looking pretty like a pretty industrial future, with the potential need for the human race to synthesize its oxygen through, like, hydrolyzing beryllium or something. I'm just joking. I don't know how they would create oxygen. Like, it's like comes from somewhere. It's some sort of part of a earth containing it's some sort of part of a mineralized part of the earth's crust. And it just so happens that pretty much everyone agreed we should keep our fingers crossed that the plants don't decide to make a city-state and get into the Mesopotamian empirical arena, because we would have to say, after doing the research, we find it to be that were we need to extract our own oxygen from the mineralized, wherever it comes from, it would take more effort than allowing the plants to grow free and wild. So, although it was more of a reactionary, like, sort of summit to prepare for the potential, or isolitarianization of the conglomerating plant peoples. Um, it definitely allowed the human race to observe the potential need to observe plant habitat and individual on a per plant basis, like care to make room in this sort of concept of what one's thoughts were of things that could include that plant existing, um, for the sake of the the reappreciating and you know uh, cherishing of the you know beneficial contribution that they make to the atmospheric content in light of the steep sort of curve of difficulty that it would take overcoming to attain the machinery and technical skills to provide ourselves with that equivalent amount. And it worked out that the plants were in a good mood that day, or are in a good mood generally. If that's what it you know is per se, I'm not really sure. I usually see them during gardening time, which is when, for the most part, I would presume plants would be happy too. So though it's hard to say. Well, let's just say I'm not sure if I've ever really seen an angry plant, or a sort of disgruntled looking plant or an upset looking plant. So that might have been some sort of like graphic marketing part of the advertising of the the plant A oxygen A collaborative thing or whatever. There's no doubt though that the you know that the innate carbon dioxide producing effect of our respiratory system is part of the reason why the plants decided not to become a medieval warrior country state. That, and that they also don't have the same sort of physiological makeup as the human species in the area of the Mediterranean and such. And they didn't want to have to reconstruct their game plan once the Geneva Convention came out, so they being the future knowing type of beings that they are, instead created a TV network that produced a series about a hypothetical world in which they did go into the arena of the Mesopotamian warring countries and such, or like mini country states or whatever it was. The and though at the same time did did not do that in actuality, and became a Geneva Convention core fundamental philosophical primary source for nominatee ideas to the to the UN or whoever created the Geneva Convention, and in doing so demonstrated to the world the you know large amounts of thoughtfulness and compassion that the flora of the world have for the fauna of the world, and also demonstrated that the powers of future telling can be used for a third group of things, not just evil and interesting predictions, but also kind of good. They didn't invent the Geneva Conventions themselves. They were able to psychically derive that it was going to occur in the future, and then diligently went to philosophizing about the fundamental topics of the types of things that would be in and of it, and that the Geneva Convention would be of, such as the laws that govern what type of war is legal between countries and all that sort of thing, which is an amazing thing in and of itself. It's like it almost transcends logic, but definitely transcends a earlier era almost vulgar, almost primitive separation in existence and in things in which there's no reason or valid cause to observe any sort of separation of things within the as far as what is the playing field of war, if or the the playing field the playing field of war of what is the the bounds of civil the bounds of modern I guess it's hard to it's a hard concept to consider, that to be going to war to some degree requires a sort of excuse me so for it to require any sort of mind frame is a sort of bewildering sort of thought in general. I'm not a big strategic player or anything like that. I'm not didn't really partake in too many risk games, but the underlying sort of adherence that countries that may or may not be warring or whatever have within their regard to being in alignment with the Geneva Convention is it's even just it's contemplatively don't isn't at some point, if you're diplomatic enough to take a good look at the Geneva Convention and then get your forces in line with it, that you could not so inconceivably go from there to a diplomatic resolution with whatever the sort of adversarial whatever country or whatever would be. But it's definitely in the sort of full scope of what the opposite would mean, or the alternate to that would mean. um, you know con- you know conceptually valid. It's not like that in some sense, that the feeling of the necessity to go to some sort of war to affect some sort of political cause or whatever, um, doesn't necessitate a type of mind state which would then you know um, be the equivalent to, like, what you would get if you went like beyond all of the, like, conventions in the Geneva Convention. And so it's, although it's hard to say, like, how can you how it's I guess. So what I've just come to find out in kind of observing it is that in the scope of things, when you see and you approach and you, like, engage in whatever it is that is, like, the militaristic um, offensive maneuvers and tactical sort of affecting of invasion of wherever is being the, like, wherever it is that a country is invading or whatever. And I'm using the rhetorical you here. When you go and do that, if you're in some sort of um, mind state of doing that within the regards of needing to for whatever reason, and or wanting to be or whatever, because I mean, first, in some way or shape or form, it's like there's the potential that it might be because of a wanting thing. It's like obviously there's you know you're gonna be a little bit hard pressed here to try and know if I'm even capable of necessarily hypothesizing of this sort of things from that sort of point of view of, like, know governmental committee, whatever, people that those political figure people are, that go about making these actual decisions. But you know there's only a limited number of reasons that you could be, like, necessitating doing so, and there's no feasibility of you know ruling one of them out, because it seems some sort of way you know in in un I don't know, unsavory or whatever that is. And that would be if whatever the reason were that somewhere we're invading some other where, it was because more of, like, a want to do so rather than, like, a need to do so. Like, I mean, it's got a whole likelihood of that. It's a expansion, or a offensive outward, the need to do expanding, militaristic sort of. It's like, that's even got a sort of um, idiosyncratic function if it works in the way that it seems like it would, as you would think of war generally, or would want to, which would be that it wouldn't be like the desired thing. But anyways, in the scope of, if and wherever and whatever it is that the sort of mind state of the thought of the decision making deciders that go to war or whatever, in a hypothetical scenario, which happens, I mean, in the world, like in the like Eastern Europe and stuff, and in all across the world basically, in those sort of in the scope of things such as those, and regarding those things, it's easy to, once you kind of evaluate what the options are, see that there may very well be the feeling of the need to do such a militaristic, in offensive whatever, um, that doesn't involve entirely overstepping every aspect of the Geneva Convention, which would be like essentially like pure madness. Like there's it's easy to see that it makes a little bit of sense that, um, although you might assume that an ability to like perceive and respect and adhere to the Geneva conventions would indicate a diplomatic sort of, a diplomatic like agility that would potentially, facilitate a diplomatic or non-war containing resolution. It definitely doesn't go to stand to reason that, um, the only time that a person would ever feel like needing to go to war would be in, involving like entirely overstepping every aspect of the Geneva Convention. Like that's ridiculous. People definitely go to war in like whatever way they go to war in the scope of countries of whatever, like political sort of like movement or whatever. And it may involve aspects of that or something in one way or another, and intentionally or undecidedly, or within like the scope of mishandling of like the sort of, um, military and or all these other sort of random conventions, or just like whatever it is. And some of those things would be like um, well, if one like soldier like puts on like the uniform of the opposite army, he's like violating the Geneva Convention for sure. Um, that's more or less like not something that's like implemented on a wide scale in some sort of fashion ever, in a sense. And if it is like undergone by an individual who decides to do that, it's not like representative of the entire sort of nation or something like that because of that. If like bio warfare is like part of like something involved in that, that tends to a little bit more be something that's it's not likely that like it was a single somehow, done in a sort of unintentional sort of way. It's, I mean, somewhat plausible, but it's more or less likely to be like an intentional like sort of highly like um, just like barbaric and cruel sort of like warfare or whatever. And you know targeting like civilians, or like making I guess like like certain sort of minefields. I think there might be there's conventions against, I think, certain things like that and stuff. Uh yeah, like all of the things though. Yeah, if the feeling of needing to go to war equated to the expression of that um, having the detail of being, in excess of all of the, limits of sort of, sanity and, semi, um, you know, civility sort of esqueness that the Geneva Convention details. Um, that both wouldn't be good, and it would also be like, clearly, just, it would either mean that you were like, entirely infinitely diplomatic, or that you, at the slightest notion would, uptake into, you know, insano mode of like war, just out of like, some, any, whatever political thing would, necessitate the decision to go to war. And it's, a rather incompatible sort of like function, because the people who make those decisions and the sort of structure and sanity that's like sort of in inter welded within like the life and scope and, um, like understanding of that person within the scope of their, functions as a, militaristic, political sort of like decision maker and whatever. Um, don't lend me to believe that, it goes from like, the like, peace maintaining study of whatever the political factors are, then straight to some sort of, completely, just, off, you know, off of like, I don't even know, just like, um, just, I don't know, I guess crazed, maniacal war, like, what is it called? I guess, like deployment and like, it's like, it's kind of a good, it's kind of a gruesome and a little bit of a like, disturbing thought to think of what that would be if you did, train your, and structure your, forces on the, you know, to be on the outer lying edge of like, the sort of rules of war. But nonetheless, if it seems crazy that you, can't come to a diplomatic resolution, even though you can, um, adhere to general, like fair play sort of cordiality in like, um, warring, like it kind of does, at first glance, you know, consider what is implied, and the meaning is if you, derive from that what the alternate option would be, which would be that upon determining that something had to be done to be, you know, satisfying either the desire to be empirical or the necessity to like, maintain the sovereignty of, or a, you know country, land, or something like that, um, directly to, you know some sort of, it completely entirely, it's hard to put a describing word on what the sort of valuation is of the things that go outside of the Geneva Convention are, because they're just like, it's like horrific and like, uh, inhumane, and like, but that like, doesn't put enough like emphasis on the entire just like demonicness of it. And then demonicness is a religious reference, and it's like doesn't it's like it it is like if someone's going in that sort of in is it, that that thought basically is like a little bit more than like something that's just labeled demonic. It's like that's like it's just like catastrophically just like there's definitely, at least for me, a lack of way of a lack of being able to say particularly the words to describe what that would be. um, and it's not a really big surprise because it's not generally something that people want to think of or think of necessarily. It's like there is this whole range of horrific type of war that goes on that is much less horrific than it could be and falls within the Geneva Convention and is more or less like the kind of like accepted status quo type of war. And don't get me wrong, as far as I understand, there's like at least you know some political powers and countries and stuff that aren't on board with the Geneva Convention and such. I don't know exactly that. I don't know that for sure, but I know that it's. I'm pretty sure that that's. I mean, I would think that I would know if every country in the world, I would think that anybody would know if every country in the world were adherent to the Geneva Convention. Like, for some reason, I feel like that would be like common knowledge if it were that per se. But that there's probably like insurgent nations and stuff that are like there's probably some insurgent nations that aren't adherent to the Geneva Convention. Yeah, it's yeah, and so without a doubt, it's like even on that level of things, there's still some sort of lack of there being an entire like overstepping of every Geneva Convention detail, and that's a good thing. And generally, if you know it is a thought that comes to mind, and you were to say, how do you feel my opinion is about that, or what might you say about it to suggest, maybe a way to look at it that is, able to be thought through to a, opinion of the matter. I would say to thou, you know, the something along the lines of the description of the circumstance of the highly likely the highly like understandably um I guess it's hard to say that warring is like commonplace or like known to be like an occurrence, but the highly understandable human condition emotion of the need to take up arms in a situation, and the way that that applies to how a country goes to war with a country, and the sort of like initial sort of descriptive type of value that like idea or word would have, which or political decision would have, which would be like if a country's which would be like, that it's like, kind of crazy, it's like if a country's going to war, they, you know, are especially if they're going offensively into war, it's like not hard to see that as being like kind of a little bit crazy. Um, you know, um, if it's like, that they're going to war because they're being like, invaded or something like that, and it's more of a defensive thing, it's not as easy to see that as necessarily being like, they're not really like it's not like crazy to like defend oneself and such. But in regard of that, if one country is on the offensive and that is like, kind of at first glance, uh, categorically like sort of, you know, having a you know perceivable type of description particularity, that you could describe as, um, you know, something like that, like an intensely like overboard sort of mental sort of like, like uh, a fit or something. It's like there's like a definitely there's different plethora to describe the sort of sentiment on the individual human sort of level of getting to that point of feeling the need to take up arms and whatever. Um, but you definitely can guess that, and can look at the past in history that to some extent countries that got, like whatever sort of political sort of like notion, necessity, sort of mind state, like sort of like, hyped up enoughness to shift their like war machine into drive and like take up arms and stuff. Considering that, for one, it's like, like the recurring occurrence of like, movement of like, of like the like, diaspora of human, existence across the earth in to some degree, and more so in different and more sort of like, violent ways, I'm guessing, in the sort of concentrating climate of, the land masses of the European continent and the areas around there. The you know you also, if on that token, if on any token it gains valuation as being something that you have an opinion of, then for the most part, unless I'm understanding the way the scale works, that you can then also evaluate it and, admit, and apply a, descriptive value, um, that is basically a reference to its virtue of not being, entirely Geneva Convention violating sort of outgo of war. And generally speaking, this is like, I'm mostly saying, and I'm not saying that that has never happened. I mean, it's entirely plausible. You know, it, I may very well could be able to, I may very well may be able to think of a specific example. I doubt it though, considering I definitely don't know the entire Geneva Convention. But, you know, some scenarios of war could be possibly, you know, fulfilling of that level of things. But when we look at the major sort of wars and seeing them as we see them, we, don't really get too much of a, um, similar. We don't get too much of a, like, thorough, view or grasp upon the feelings and the inner workings of the, minds that make the decisions to make the invasions and cause the wars to occur. But we do get an, you know, view that we have and see of how that war is undertaken. Um, and from that, which we can derive, you know, be it that, being offensive in war is, crazy to some degree because, you're like, going and causing like war. Um, it's, also within the, description of that in the historical, context and in the historical, um, you know, detailed, the historically, like, the historical, the historical writings and such of these events, it's probably not very identify that are not Geneva Convention um, violating. Say that it, if one of the disregarded, it's like of it disregarding the entire thing. It may or may not be the. I'm not sure exactly how the convention works literally, or if that even matters or applies to how it is labeled that, and how it might, be that it's, you know, preferred to be interpreted by the, Geneva Convention. Even is what, if there even is a convention, like in the sort of physical gathering sense. Um, I know that I'm just, equally as used to thinking of it as being as being actually, I'm more or less thought, the Geneva Convention, if you think about it in like the way to say like, like a potentially plural, like type of like protocol for things, isn't the same as the way I've normally thought about it. I normally think of convention as being like gathering of people. So it's like, anyways, it brings a sort of smile to my face to think of the funniness of that. But the Geneva Convention adhering offensive of whatever countries, um, if I don't think that the first rule of the Geneva Convention is like don't go to war, and then the next rule is like, if you do go to war, do this and do this, and it may very well be, but if it were that, the implication would be that it's like direct and individual sort of like, laws or whatever international war, um, policy per se, and if you can see a partial adherence to the Geneva Convention, then you can definitely derive from that that there is a more insane way of going about whatever wars in the past were gone about, and that would, that would contain, that could at least be redacted, um, to reflect the full amount of, a further amount of insanity just by, you know, considering all of the aspects of the Geneva Convention, and then, undertaking the hypothetical re-envisionment of it as being that, um, in that way. And we, no doubt, kind of are more or less probably transfixed with, the, immediate necessities to, like, maintain our, like, health and our, like, existence outside of the way of harm. And and in a cascading sort of way, like, there are other things that are more important in considering in looking back at the wars, like such as like what caused that to occur, and like what how what is the how do we did we prevent these like wars from occurring and all that sort of thing. Um, but if going specifically to address this particular um, like opinionation or like valuation in the scope of things, because it's not all that unlikely. In fact, I started this dissertation of these plausible misunderstandings being a relative lack of viewing the further um, the further sort of expansion of the hypothetical of the Geneva Convention itself per se, and those misunderstandings would be that going to war would be entirely or would be the most crazy of things, because going to war generally doesn't mean exceeding everything in the Geneva Convention. It means something along the lines of like the way that war outgoes in the past, in sort of the different chronicles of it, and it involves things that are within the Geneva Convention naturally. Like that's you know a definite sort of thing. And when uh, when the valuation of it changes in that way, that going to war isn't the most crazy thing, then the not crazy at all thing becomes the incredibly potently peaceful thing per se. If it's not crazy, if it's not overly crazy to go to war, then it's not just standard to not go to war. Then it's you know and it definitely doesn't turn into it's crazy not to go to war. It definitely just goes into you- the scope of things as they are, which is truly and we can see this in sort of the modern societies in our modern culture, that there is an a necessity for effort to be put into a overall peaceful fabric of the way society works. Um, and that sort of way of relating the detail of some sort of you know relevance of you know the anecdotal perception and detail of the Geneva Convention, and what the different sort of ways to be seen in regard to it, or however that is said, or whatever. I guess I should say, and or what I'm, or and so on, and those sort of things. Um, is is fine by me. I wasn't really going into the description of it for reasons
Hello?
to have a
Hello?
strategic. Hello, how are you doing? For to I'm not is more or less to observe a
Are you waiting for someone?
yep, I'm waiting for someone.
Who are you waiting for?
Um sorry, I'm in the middle of something right now.
Yeah, that's fine, but you can't have that over here.
All right. So
So you can take it somewhere else.
and in the scope of things, it's
Sir?
most likely part of
Sir?
what I was desiring to
So you
point out
I can
about
call
the
someone to
thing
help you leave.
about
Do you
the
understand what I'm saying? I'm talking to you. You can leave right now,
scope of
or I can have someone
how
help you leave. Because you cannot be here.
in the relative
Excuse me?
concepts and the way that they interrelate of things, and
Okay,
particularly
I'm gonna call the police on you
rules
so that they can help you leave because you cannot be here.
and
Do you understand?
ways that we interact and such. And the type of thing that to see peace as being something that more or less, is needing of a description as to it being like a intention requiring and like energy, like you know putting towards sort of effort and or occurrence as a sort of as a way that things can be, um, is is definitely like something more along the lines of what is something that is what I would value as being worth taking a look at you know taking a look at a anecdotal construct of human interaction, as far as a purpose of if there were to be one, other than what the other sort of general purpose of elaborating on the topic is, or you know was and such, and that is for doing the sake of it itself. It's got many aspects of benefit in that, one, explaining ideas or elaborating on thoughts, and brushing up on some of the things that I know a little bit of about the topic, and coming to think about things I might not have thought about per se in the scope of the topic, which definitely occurred. It's like I hadn't really thought about the concept in general that and I had been, and the reason I started was to um, describe the general sort of sense of like some sort of presumption that if a country can have a concept, if a country can be patient and diplomatic enough to adhere to the Geneva Convention, that doesn't that categorically make it entirely feasible that they could then come to a diplomatic resolution altogether, and then after really boiling down what the meaning of that comes out to be, which is you know not how, which is when you say or think of the concept, definitely not anywhere near equivalent of anywhere near the sort of like accurate description of what you would think of things, or what you sort of what I would think anybody understands things as being, which would be that the notion of the need to become militaristically engaging in some sort of way, even in the outward way, um, is the equivalent of an entirely to the full hilt, maximum amount of like craziness. it's it's just kind of like the like sort of latent, sort of unobserved necessarily like detail of what it is to assume that you know any ability to adhere to to contemplate an adheration to rules of war would generally guarantee a ability to come to some sort of resolution um, nationally within whatever the sort of disagreement or whatever the issue is in whatever sort of two-part way or however many part way that is occurring, and it's got other sort of, I guess, things I would say that are things or included sort of thought and dialogue sort of types of comparison and like ways of conveying the way to see things in order to discuss them, I guess. And I could mention a few of those. It's getting further and further though off of the sort of succinctness of where I was feeling the topic was going quite recently when I was noting the sort of derivability that the concept that peace takes effort is or has to it which was which I partially was inclined to
Hello.
mention or reference to because of
The
a
resident here asked
sort
to
of
leave several times. He won't respond to me. He's just on his phone and he can't be here. It's not his.
Is he trying to come in the building or just hanging out here?
He's just hanging out. It's residential area and residents.
Hi, how you doing tonight?
How does that? Do you speak English?
Of course. Yeah, I know. I acknowledged her and talked to her and responded to her. I told her I was like, I'm I'm in the middle of making a like webcast, and I,
Okay.
no,
Stop for a
nothing.
second.
Oh yeah, no,
Question. Do you have any weapons on you?
of course not.
Don't
No,
go
yeah.
in your pockets.
I'm not going to put my phone in my pocket.
Don't touch your phone. Don't go in your pocket.
Okay, so I'm
Do me a
and
favor. Stand up.
she know. I
Stand
mean,
up. Stand up. Stand
so
up.
okay, my friend invited me over,
Stand
and
up.
I was chilling at her house, and I've left, and I'm and what?
I'm just check you. Make sure
Okay,
you're
okay,
good.
I'm sorry. Like I just like and I'm sorry that I didn't acknowledge the kind lady or whatever the right way or something, but I did acknowledge her, and I mean
What is this?
she
What
did,
is this?
it's I don't know, like a lighter or something. I just my random effects, like I'm just so is could I like offer to like just kind of continue on or something like that? I really didn't like think that there was like some sort of there was like a crime to like sit on the porch here, like we okay, well I mean like my friend, like when we chill here, it seems like I and I wasn't. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't like causing any harm or anything. I just felt like um, I would.
Have a seat.
Uh,
You want-
you know, head out when I was done recording my thing or whatever. I wasn't trying to cause a problem. Sorry that you guys had to like come and.
Where's your ID card?
I actually don't have an ID. It's just
It's all screwed up.
oh, you want to? Oh,
Anything in here with your name on it?
oh, I thought you said there's everything there. There's one. I have like a ticket that I got from like a MTA or something like that. Yeah. I can tell you my name. I mean, like I have no problem telling you my name. It's
Are you on probation for anything?
no.
Have you ever been arrested?
No, like I think, or yeah, not like recently or anything, but
What were you arrested for?
like some petty thing or something. Like I don't know.
Some petty drug, some petty theft, what?
Probably I don't know, like something like that. Like yeah, it's like a.
Is that here in San Francisco?
So if you want, I can. I mean, like I know you guys are like this is like a situation or incident or something now, but like I'm sorry, like I was,
Why don't you tell us your name?
Okay.
There's nothing in there.
Well, yeah, no, it's like there. It is. My name is Kyle Varela. Okay, cool. Well, then you can, get it from ticket.
Can you read it? Spell your last name for me.
V is in Victor, Arela.
E-L-A.
Yeah, Varela.
And your date of birth is 11/29/83.
Yes.
8/14. Wanted to run that over.
Do you mind if I pack up? There's
No.
sandals in there.
You
Oh,
don't know anything right now.
oh, okay.
8/14 West, Varela, Victor Alpha, Romeo Echo, Lima Alpha, first Kyle, Martin Stone, and date of birth is 11/29/1983. Is that the ID number? Yeah, ID number. So he had the ID, you got to take it. What was the ticket taken?
No, I didn't. The person asked my ID number, and I tried to approximate it. It's like D700463 or something like that.
Failed to display.
It's like a metro ticket for not having a ticket on the bus or something like that. But yeah, I have no problem leaving. I was just gonna be heading out anyways. I was just finishing up what I was working on, and like,
What were you working on?
well, I was working on like just like a webcast that was a topic about the different like things that are in the Geneva Convention, and like how it's analogous to certain sort of ways that we see each other in like the scope of things, like because the Geneva Convention like is like the rules that you can't dress up as like the enemy's soldier, or that you can't use biological warfare and stuff like that, and you'd think that if you can adhere to like some sort of rules, you should be able to come to a diplomatic resolution about like a war issue or something, but that topic doesn't really that logic doesn't quite play out, because definitely when people go to war, they definitely aren't going like in violation of the Geneva Convention in every single way, because I mean that's just like it's like a philosophical sort of topic to look at. It's part of my
So you missed the court date. What was that for?
Petty theft, I think, or something.
Larceny, theft?
Yeah, the like court and going into like the CJ quarter, whatever is like what I'm hoping to do with that case, or ask if they'll do, and I do need to make sure to like go and get back on the calendar for that because it happened a little bit further ago than I guess I thought. San Francisco County. Big on like
Okay, well, the issue is
When she told you she was calling the police.
wasn't trying to or anything, and I apologize for the the way that it had to come to this. I was just like about to leave.
You're not supposed to wait till the police get here to decide to leave. You're
Um,
supposed to leave before the police get here so that you don't have to get arrested for the warrant that you have.
yeah, I guess so. I
a
mean,
warrant is probably the best idea to head out when the police are.
yeah, I guess there's always the chance that they will do like
Go ahead and turn around, put your hands on your back for me.
okay, what is that called then when they do the thing with the like what is it called? Like citation or book inside or they
They'll cite you at the jail. I don't believe it's a bench warrant. So.
Oh,
you
I how
get a cite from the jail and be released from down there with the new court date. It was a bench warrant? Oh, yeah, you're gonna be held to your court.
oh, I thought the bench warrant was the less serious kind.
No, bench warrant means the judge wants to see you before you
Oh.
get released.
Yeah, well that's like the
Yes.
Oh, you're gonna need a cop photo too.
that is the kind though that I think
See if they have.
I was recording on.